In this episode of BEA Conversations on Mental Fitness to Leadership, we're speaking with Martin Sirk, a respected leader in the business events industry. Martin is the owner of Sirk Serendipity, and he serves as an advisor to organizations like the Global Association Hubs Partnership, TEDx Amsterdam, as well as a tech startup called Cubify. Am I right, Martin?
Correct, yes.
Fantastic. Martin, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Al. Doing well.
That's good to hear. Now, I know that you have been writing quite a bit around uncertainty in the International Association and business event sectors. Share with us, what are your thoughts around the challenges facing leaders in this era, and what type of mental fitness is required of them?
Okay, well, first of all, great talking to you, Al. Thanks for inviting me. I've been writing about uncertainty because I realized that one of the big things the pandemic has done is that it's removed veils from our eyes. As leaders, when we were putting our strategic plans together or thinking about the future, we typically believed that we knew about, 70 or 80% of what the world looked like. We had a degree of certainty that we took for granted. And what the pandemic has done is switch that on its head, so that now, if we're lucky, we have 20% certainty and 80% uncertainty. And what that means is that it's incredibly difficult to now be a leader, because traditionally we've been expected to project certainty and direction and knowledge. And now, as leaders, it's important, actually, I think, to be a bit more vulnerable, to admit to your teams and to the world that you don't have all the answers, that you don't know that. And what follows from that is, well, what can you project? What is realistic? And it seems to me that a lot of the most forward-thinking companies and the leaders that I've noticed are reverting back to the mission of the organization. You know, this is a time when the financial quarter results have become far less important than maintaining the community and refocusing on what your company or your association or your organization actually exists for. And as leaders, I think it's a job to project that to all the stakeholders, whether they're customers or staff or in some other way part of the community. If you're an association, obviously your membership. So that's the starting point, I think. To admit that you don't know everything, to be a bit more vulnerable there, and then to refocus back and say, what are we here for? What's it all about?
How can leaders who are, because it sounds to me like the traditional strategic planning is already out the window, and where would they get inspiration to keep up with that mental fitness that is required of them?
Okay. Well, I think it's getting an understanding of risk and not being paralyzed by risk is really important. And to do that, I think we need to differentiate between two different types. There's the existential risk. Will my company still be here? What can I do to make sure it'll be here next year? What can I do to safeguard the relations with my community? And day-to-day risk. And actually, what I've seen from talking to association leaders is that the smart ones are embracing the need for experimentation. So mentally, we have to fight against the idea that we have to be risk averse in everything we do. We've got to take those things which are really, really vital, that are going to determine if we're there tomorrow, put them over here and they're done. But then all the other things are up for grabs. I think we are actually in a huge era of experimentation. And we can see that just through the way in which people are addressing the online world and online meetings. There is no way of doing things generally accepted. Audiences, participants accept experimentation, and they will do for a little bit more. So we're in this hugely opportunistic period. The same goes for how do you empower your staff? How do you give them the power to be more experimental and to take risks? that's a big question for a leader, letting go a little bit. And I know in Asia there's more of a hierarchical mindset than in other parts of the world. And you know, I've seen people talking about working from home and how it could go in two different directions. Either you get 24/7 surveillance by the bosses, or you get genuine empowerment of your staff. So again, for leaders, there's this issue of how do you let go of it? How do you get to trust your teams? And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges for anyone who wants to be successful. You have to have staff and teams that you can trust. You have to let go and let them get on with it, because the experimental stuff cannot all come from the mind of the leader. The leader might be a great innovator and very, very smart, but it's literally impossible for them to be the holder of all the possibilities for their organization to be successful.
Can I ask about the approach or the resources required to communicate with stakeholders, investors who still have, you know, very strong return on investments expectations through experimentation?
Yeah, you know, everybody wants a slice of the resources, and yet for any leader to successfully navigate this, they have to communicate like crazy. I think of, for example, Kai Hattendorf, who's the head of UFI, the Exhibition Industry Association, and the Joint Meetings Industry Council. Very, very clear, solid, consistent communication on all levels. And he's communicating probably, I would guess, 4 or 5 times more than he did before the crisis hit. And so partly it's a question of resource allocation. Resources in terms of time, resources in terms of making the bandwidth available, but also making sure you've got very, very clear messaging in order to take advantage of that communication. So, you know, it's not at all easy, that's for sure. And I don't have all the answers, none of us do. But once you're clear about what your mission is and what you're trying to achieve, you've got to allocate time for communication. And that communication's got to be not just top down, it's also got to be listening. I was on the conference call with an association leader just 2 days ago, and they were talking about moving resources into the communication sector to ensure that they really accurately pull information out from their members around the world. And they were finding new ways of empowering groups of their own members to take on some of that burden. So they had entirely redesigned their circular communication processes so that many more people were involved.
Martin, I know that having time to think or having think space is very important to you. Can you explain to us a little bit why thinking and allocating time to think is important, and what do you think about?
Okay. Well, because I'm running my own consultancy at the moment. I used to run an organization with 1,200 member companies and organizations in 100 countries and 6 regional offices. So I know that in my old life, I would have had to work really much harder to create that time. In my current life, I have the luxury that I can allocate more time. So I know it's difficult, but I've always in my business life tried to carve out space when I can do things which are not directly related to the day-to-day business objectives. So any long-haul flights that I used to take would always be allocated to reading things that I'd heard about that might be interesting, that might stimulate new ideas. I would always get personally involved in thinking about the content of the events that my organization was running, so that I could add some creative insights from left field into that. And I would even do what I used to call a random walk about once a month, where I would literally take one good idea, look on the net, see where it went, see who was talking about that, see where it went just randomly, I ended up with some of the most interesting, relevant, unknown speakers at my own industry organizations events as a result of doing that random walk. I think it's healthy for any leader not to simply spend their life in their narrow specialist furrow. You've got to occasionally reach out and both talk to people from outside and also read and study and think about the bigger areas. There's no single way of doing this. But I'd like to make an additional point, because it relates from that into the future of business events and meetings, actually. The most creative association leaders that I've spoken to have almost universally been talking to me about how do they expand the intellectual capital that can be brought into their events and into their community. The smart ones are thinking about new forms of partnership. They're thinking, which other organizations are aligned with our values and our mission? How can we actually do things together with them? Now, in the old days, that might have been, let's create a meeting together. Now it might be, let's create a common advocacy platform so that we can speak with a much louder voice when we're talking to policymakers. So I think that in the new normal that's coming, I think that leaders are going to have to reimagine the role of partnerships in the future of their organization. And these partnerships could be with the strangest people. It could be with competitors. It could be with their own community, their own members if they're an association, or their own customers if they're a company. Again, I was just talking to one of the top guys in the Project Management Institute recently for an education program I'm running with him as one of my panel. Project Management Institute has set up a program to exploit is probably the wrong word, but let's call it exploit the brain power and the knowledge of the 80 most innovative companies within their community membership. So they are building these internal partnerships in a much, much deeper way than they ever imagined before. And actually, the pandemic has allowed them to accelerate this process. Before, this is something that would have probably taken years of board discussions and position papers and worry. Now there's a clear understanding that if they don't harness that brain power, if they don't somehow use the resources that are within those innovative companies to make themselves even more innovative, they will fail to grow as fast as they could. So there's some really cool stuff happening around this.
Yeah, that's a brilliant example. How I think often they're not leaders, they think a lot, right? And then now I think it's become even more competitive if you have a brilliant idea. And to be generous enough to share it across the industry, how can one balance the protection of IP, but yet to share enough that will benefit the industry?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I remember back in, I don't know, probably 30 years ago, I read a book by Faith Popcorn, who was a very famous futurist at the time. A lot of her big mega trends have actually come true, by the way. And she was saying that sharing is the new competitive advantage. It's no longer companies that hold all of their intellectual capital to themselves, but the ones who are willing to actually reach out beyond that will gain traction because of economies of scale, because of whatever. And I think this is the tie into that partnership thinking that I'm talking about. I'm not saying give away all your intellectual capital necessarily. I know that in a lot of cultures, a lot of companies, that's a real no-no. But if you use that intellectual capital not as simply something that is beneficial to you, but as an asset that you can leverage to build stronger partnerships, you can then take advantage of the intellectual capital of far wider organizations who want to use yours, but also will then be willing to reciprocate with theirs. So I think a lot of the openness is this reciprocal sharing of competitive advantage to build even stronger advantage. And this is really critical for so many companies, because if you're not number one or number two, you can almost be nowhere in the world that is being built at the moment. So for most of us, we're involved in smaller organizations, SMEs, associations. We're not in that big scale of the tech giants and these other monsters. So how can you compete? Ultimately, you can only really compete if you can harness the collective intelligence and collective assets of others who actually share your mission. If you simply narrowly define your competitive set as the other DMCs or PCOs in your country, you're kind of missing a trick, because you can't grow the cake together. I think on that point, it's good to widen it out beyond even the companies and the associations to talk about public-private sector partnerships. And I think Singapore is a fantastic example of smart government thinking, of working out where the public sector needs to play a role and where the private sector needs to play a role. And the public sector's role of taking the overarching view and thinking, how can our entire sector be competitive in 10 and 20 years? Something that it's impossible for the SME to do. So I think that for a lot of reasons, Singapore is a really good exemplar of that kind of joined up thinking. And I think that any company that's based in your home base, they know that this type of thinking exists. They probably actually, in many cases, take it for granted. In most countries, that doesn't exist. You have to build it yourself.
Great point of view. As at BEA, we have been exploring conversations with leaders, towards the journey of mental fitness. And one of the elements that we found that is quite common, that is mentioned by some of our leaders, is the fact that they say that being inspired or having inspiration actually motivates that mental fitness, and put you into a positive spin and positive mindset toward possibilities. So what is the one thing that could have inspired you during COVID?
Oh, well, I suppose it's not one single thing, but in the last 6 or 7 months, I have seen dawn rising more times than in my previous 60 years.
Wow.
And that has been really quite something for me. One of my regular things is dawn walks in the Amsterdam parks. I've downloaded my bird song identifier onto the phone, but walking at dawn, when the city belongs to you and there's nobody else there, it has been, as a kind of, well, how would you say it? It's a way of deep relaxation. It's a way of reconnecting. I think I've been reading so much of people who have been baking sourdough bread and they've been doing walks on the coast. So many people have taken advantage to step back from the rat race. So many of us are working from home, that we actually can take the commute time and turn that into something valuable. I think there is a risk of typical leaders can be workaholics, of just getting so much into it all the time. But to me, it's been those early morning walks to see dawn rise. That's been very, very special.
Oh, very nice. Martin, thank you so much for your time. I think, as you know, you are one of the leaders that I really look up to. And one key thing that I took away from what you say today to me personally was the fact that you went for that long walk and just picking one idea, because more often than not, I tend to have too many ideas in my head, and that could lead to overthinking or underestimating the amount of time that I have, and I end up not fulfilling what I set out to do. So I think that is a great advice to mental fitness. And on that note, once again, thank you so much for your brilliant words.
Thank you very much, Al. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye. you.